That is the correct answer.
Yes!
What in the world?
That was totally...
The predecessor of the electric companies that made oil and candles.
I'm never doing this with you again.
1845. Welcome to TBC Extra, a weekly podcast of our Sunday sermon and a little extra. I am Teresa Jenkins, the communications director here at Topeka Bible Church.
And I'm Jason Brent, the children's pastor at Topeka Bible Church, and we're glad you're here. And now for a little extra.
Hey, thanks for joining us for another episode of TBC Extra. Hello, friends. So glad you're here.
Hey, how's it going?
Alan and Jason. You know, we're continuing our Beating Burnout series, and because we try to be efficient with TBC Extra, meaning we don't try to spend hours and hours. We kind of want to do it, make it good, let it go. Good enough to move on.
Yes, there you go.
Who would say?
Craig Rochelle.
We got to get
Alan
on
yeah,
that.
I'm not on
we need
the
to
Craig
catch him up this
Rochelle
week.
train. I did see him at the conference we went to, but that's been about it.
About it. I'll send you some podcasts.
Okay.
Good. Yeah.
So, good enough to move on is what we're going for. And so I grabbed my quizzes and things from the internet, and I have another fire quiz, but this one is not biblical fire.
Ooh.
This is historical fire, which biblical fires are also historical, but you know what I'm trying to say.
So I have a better chance against Jason on this one, I think.
It's historical fires of biblical proportions?
Some of them probably
Some of them,
are.
all right. I do not know much about... I know some things about creating fires, but that's about it.
Do
I
tell.
can't do
Don't tell.
No.
All right,
That's for
let's
another
demonstrate.
podcast.
Right.
Maybe next week. That's because we have two more Beating Burnout.
I'll just say, I
episodes.
grew up in North Topeka in a fairly boring community, and so fire was a lot of the only thing we had to play with. So
Very good. Good thing you were in a floodplain.
there you go.
Because
Yes.
eventually, chances are your fires would be flooded out. All right, guys, I have 4 questions for you. Multiple choice. Please play along at home. I would hate to think that my 5 minutes of internet research is going to waste for just the three of us.
If you do play along, record either on YouTube or email us or text us. Comment section. That's a good one.
Emails.
Yeah. So put your score so we can know how miserably we got destroyed.
I know. They could send it via smoke signals.
And video it and then post it to one of the platforms that we support.
Yes. Fire Spark.
TBC Fire.
TBC Fire Spark. All right. First question. In 1613, so before Alan was born.
1613. Yes.
Maybe before all of us were born. Which London theater was destroyed by a fire that started during a production of the historical play Henry VIII?
The Globe.
Okay.
Oh, it's a multiple choice. Sorry.
It was multiple choice.
Okay.
Was it the Earth, the Ocean, the Earth Theater, the Ocean Theater, the World Theater, or the Globe Theater?
Well,
Which one was it?
I want to guess Globe, but the
Ding, ding,
I
ding.
guarantee
I'm going to take that one too.
Take it. Take them when they're handed to you, buddy.
So to be honest, that's the only theater I know in any part of Europe. Isn't that the
Same.
Isn't that a Shakespeare theater?
It is.
My
It's
wife has been there.
Shakespeare's
That's the
theater. It's been
only
rebuilt
reason.
since.
So
Yes.
I just thought I'd shoot my one shot here because that's
You
the
did
only
it.
theater I knew.
You aced it. Okay. Well, you are now excused from the rest of the questions.
That's probably the only one I'll get right.
Jamestown, the oldest permanent English settlement in North America. I should have read that last one in my English accent.
It's okay.
Jamestown, the oldest permanent English settlement in North America, was burned to the ground in September 1676 during which rebellion? Hold for the answers. Bacon's Rebellion, Freese's Rebellion, the Boston Tea Party, or the Green Corn Rebellion?
I like the green corn name. The only one I've heard of is Boston Tea Party. I'll go with green corn though.
Jason,
I like
what's your
bacon
answer?
a lot more than corn.
I assume it's someone's name.
And I think the Tea Party was later, I think. So I'm going to go with the Bacon Rebellion.
That is correct. Bacon's Rebellion.
Bacon.
I also like bacon.
Was it about bacon or was someone's name bacon?
It was someone's name.
Oh, I thought. Never mind what I thought.
You're not as big of a fan
I'm
of
going to change your answer now that you know it was the right answer.
No. I was thinking the food, not the name, but yeah.
All right. This one has nothing to do with food.
And they threw
Although
all
I'm sure
the
some
bacon
people
into
missed
the
their
harbor.
dinner. The Great New York City Fire of 1845 started in a commercial building in Manhattan. What type of business occupied the premises? A kerosene lamp factory. That sounds dangerous. A blacksmith and ironworks. A whale oil merchant and candle manufacturer. Or an electric company.
What year?
1845.
I was waiting for like automobiles an answer, but 1845 would definitely not have that. I'll go with the electric one. The
Electric company?
D, yeah.
Okay.
That's a good guess because electricity.
Probably in a very experimental phase.
I feel like if they were only working with kerosene oil, like lamps, that's possible they could burn down. But I'm going to go with the one that I think is the most interesting, the whale blubber candles.
That sounds cool.
Whale oil merchant and candle manufacturer.
They use the whale blubber to make candles.
That is what that was. That is the correct answer.
Yes!
What in the world?
That was totally...
The predecessor of the electric companies. They made oil and candles.
I'm never doing this with you again.
1845. Yeah.
If I could only do this when we have trivia games at home, because my daughter destroys me at everything. So yeah,
We play trivia. We have a competitive trivia, which I've mentioned before. Anyway,
so I only have one so far, and it's
that one.
because you got it right before she even said the answers.
That was the only theater I knew.
Next week, we're going to have fire trivia that Alan can absolutely answer by himself.
If this answer is Mrs. O'Leary's cow, then that would be good. But that's the only thing I know about
I was
fire.
hoping that would be on this list, and it was not. Okay, and that might be apocryphal. All right, a massive blast just devastated the city of Halifax, Nova Scotia on December 6th, 1917. The explosion was the result of a fire on board which ship that was carrying munitions destined for the World War I battlefields of Europe.
Ooh.
I'm going to give you 4 ship names, okay? The SS Mont Blanc. Pardon to my French friends.
Mont Blanc.
The HMY Iolaire. The USS Californian. Or the RMS Lusitania. Which one of those devastated the city of Halifax, Nova Scotia, December 6th, 1917?
Wait, December 6th, not December 7th?
No.
Okay, December 6th. Okay.
1917.
1917, yes.
I've realized that every answer I've done so far is the 4th option of D, which was what?
So don't say the RMS Lusitania.
No, I do want to say it. I'm just going to keep going with it.
Because it has to be one of them. I'm going to say, I don't know what California will be doing over there by Nova Scotia, but I'm going to go with California.
Okay, well, I was trying to dissuade you from choosing number 4.
I'm stubborn.
Because it was the 4th option for the first question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but this one is the SS Mont Blanc.
Mont Blanc.
Which was A.
Mont Blanc. Mountain of White.
How would I miss the Mont Blanc? Mont Blanc.
Well, something you don't want to miss is the sermon. Let's go to that next.
That's true.
Good morning. It's good to be back with you. Last week, Jim got us started on a brand new series. We finished 1 Corinthians. Last week, Jim got us started on a new series called Beating Burnout, with burnout kind of being that feeling that we have all experienced at one time or the other, sort of characterized by physical exhaustion, apathy, indifference, sometimes just a total lack of engagement. And it's normally characterized, some of the experts would say that it is caused by an intense load of stress that's being unsuccessfully managed. But you and I both know that that's a little too simplistic, right? Because it's not always about managing stress. It's not like you can just kick back and watch a football game or bake some cookies or whatever it is, and then you get over your hurdle. It's normally a serious life situation brought on by some kind of long-term problem, right? And so whether that's happening in your job, in your family, in some other duty or responsibility that you've got, other relationships, you know that it's not as easy as just saying, okay, well, I need to find, I need a good long weekend and then I can get over this hump. And so we wanted to look at this topic, look at it from a couple different ways and see what it takes for those in the Bible to overcome burnout when it was affecting them and how God walked them through that. Last week, right, we looked at the story of Elijah. Elijah, he was a prophet of the Lord, but he was under the reign of a wicked king and a wicked queen, Ahab and Jezebel. And he was sort of one of the few people, or at least he thought, that was fighting for the Lord's causes in Israel. And so he had these amazing moments, these literally mountaintop experiences on Mount Carmel, right, fighting the prophets of Baal. But then he thinks he's won, but he hasn't. And so he runs away, feeling defeated, like a total failure. And the Lord comes to him in that quiet, still voice and gives him rest. And that was sort of our first lesson last week, right? Was that rest and rejuvenation is important. Taking care of our physical bodies is absolutely a part of overcoming burnout. And when we try and just put the pedal to the floor and go for as long as possible, and we do that without any rest, we know that we're heading towards burnout anyway. But oftentimes we can rest in the things that the Lord has for us, and we can overcome burnout. So this morning, we're going to be looking, though, at a different situation and a different solution to burnout. And if you would, turn in your Bibles with me to Exodus 18, which is where we're going to be looking at the story of an individual we are going to be learning a lot about this spring as we head into the book of Numbers here in a couple weeks. We're going to be talking about Moses. Moses, just to get us up to speed, make sure we're all on the same page, right? We are Exodus, we're in the second book of the Bible, right? Moses has already brought the Israelites out of bondage, out of slavery, 400 years of it in Egypt. And so Moses, as their leader, has now brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is going to be a really significant place for them, and we'll get to that here in a second. But really what we're looking at this morning is what was causing Moses to experience burnout. Okay, so we'll start a couple verses in here in verse 5, chapter 18. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, along with Moses' wife and sons, came to him in the wilderness where he was camped at the mountain of God. He sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down, and then kissed him. They asked each other how they had been and went into the tent. Moses recounted to his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships that had confronted them on the way, and how the Lord had rescued him. So you might recall, in the story of Moses, right, he spent 40 years in Egypt growing up in Pharaoh's house. And then he killed the Egyptian, right, for mistreating, beating the Israelite slave. And so he goes on the run. He's on the lam. And he spends 40 years out in the wilderness then, right? And it's at the end of those 40 years, when he's about 80, is when he sees the burning bush. But in that 40-year period where he was wandering in the desert, he was a shepherd. He was around the area of Midian, and he met a woman named Zipporah, and they had 2 sons. And so Jethro is his father-in-law, as it says. But when it came time for Moses to go back to Egypt to, the whole let my people go, all that stuff, right? When it came time for him to do that, to emancipate the Israelite nation from 400 years of slavery, he left his wife and kids at home. He wanted to make sure that they would be protected, that they would be safe, and so he left them with their father, or their grandfather, rather. So now that he's come back, okay, he's got a whole train of Israelites, tens upon thousands, okay, an entire nation that has followed him. We've done the crossing of the Red Sea, the Egyptians have been defeated, and now we're sort of into this new chapter where he's dealing with a whole nation of people, okay, and as he's doing that, he has brought them, the first place that they go to is the foot of Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is where Moses is going to go up and down a number of different times to receive the law that the Lord is going to present to him, the law that is going to be the defining characteristic of the Israelite nation, how they should be run for more than the next 1,000 years. Okay? And so Moses is here, and it is also there at the foot of Mount Sinai where some problems begin to spring up. As we go on, we see that first, though, this encounter with Jethro had a very positive tone. Jethro rejoiced over all the good things the Lord had done for Israel when he rescued them from the power of the Egyptians. "Blessed be the Lord," Jethro exclaimed, "who rescued you from the power of Egypt and from the power of Pharaoh. He has rescued the people from under the power of Egypt. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because he did wonders when the Egyptians acted arrogantly against Israel." Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in God's presence. So what's interesting here is that Jethro is noted as being a priest of Midian, okay? And Midian, if you keep going in the Old Testament, they don't always get along with Israel. In fact, they're normally enemies. And so the fact that Jethro is sort of coming here, it's a bit of a peace delegation. I mean, it's his son-in-law, true, but Moses is about to go through the land of Midian. And so Jethro comes bringing his family. But the question becomes like, what was Jethro a priest of? Because what happens here is what is really significant. That Moses greets Jethro, tells him all the things that the Lord has done in rescuing them. And then Jethro has this exclamation of faith. He says, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods because of what you told me that he has done." So Jethro kind of has this conversion moment, which is then evidenced in verse 12 when he brings out this burnt offering, right? They are going to sacrifice to the Lord. So Jethro's there. He is kind of newly converted. We don't know if he's got the whole thing down yet. He's probably still got some idols back home that he's worshiping, but he understands the work that the Lord has done. And it's significant, right? The way that he found out about this information. Not only is it from Moses, but the way that it says that Moses was talking to him. Moses is going through all of the events that just happened. Jethro would be very familiar with the greatest nation in the world, Egypt, that was in his back door. And he's probably listening with bated breath as Moses is recounting all the different plagues and the things that happened so that God would bring them out. But Moses doesn't just tell Jethro about the events. He makes sure to connect it with the fact that God was the one who was doing it. It wasn't just the fact that there was a plague or that Pharaoh said, you can finally take them, leave after the death of their firstborn. No, it was that God was working the entire time. That is going to be really important as we keep going on. Now, the next day, Moses has bring your father-in-law to work day, okay? The next day, Moses sat down to judge the people, and they stood around Moses from morning until evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw everything he was doing for them, he asked, "What is this you're doing for the people? Why are you alone sitting as judge while all the people stand around you from morning until evening?" Moses replied to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. Whenever they have a dispute, it comes to me, and I make a decision between one man and another. I teach them God's statutes and laws." So Moses is sitting in the role of judge, and there are thousands upon thousands of people who are coming to him because, wouldn't you know it, the Israelites, after being saved from this 400 years of slavery and bondage and death, they come out and they're instantly upset with Moses. Where's our food? Where's our water? Where's our meat? Right? In fact, many of them end up saying that they should actually go back to being slaves in Egypt because, hey, at least we had better food there. It's better than this manna stuff. And so Moses has got a lot of problems that he's dealing with. On top of that is all the bickering and fighting that happens when a bunch of people are, hangry walking through the desert, okay? So all of these individuals are coming to Moses. And here is where the burnout begins to happen, right? Jethro is witnessing this situation, and the burden is upon Moses to impart to the nation of Israel the law and the way of God that they have simply forgotten, right? We have Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, right? We have the patriarchs, but then we have the story that goes on in Egypt, where for 400 years, they had been in bondage. They were still connected to the Lord. They were still worshiping him. They were still faithful to him to an extent, but they had forgotten many of the ways of God. And so each time somebody would come to Moses, it wasn't just handling the dispute. As it says there at the end, it comes to me and I make a decision between one man and another. I teach them God's statutes and laws. So on an almost individual basis, Moses is having to bring up and teach this nation of Israel what it means to follow after God. It's a heavy task, and he is furthermore burdened by the fact that he is the only one who is doing it. What you're doing is not good, Moses' father-in-law said to him. You will certainly wear out both yourself and these people who are with you because the task is too heavy for you. You can't do it alone. Now listen to me. I will give you some advice, and God be with you. You be the one to represent the people before God and bring their cases to him. Instruct them about the statutes and laws and teach them the way to live and what they must do. But you should select from all the people able men, God-fearing, trustworthy, and hating dishonest profit. Place them over the people as commanders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They should judge the people at all times. They can bring you every major case, but judge every minor case themselves. In this way you will lighten your load, and they will bear it with you. If you do this, and God so directs you, you will be able to endure, and also all these people will be able to go home satisfied. So here's what I think is funny about this passage, is that Jethro came to work with Moses for one day, and instantly he was like, what you're doing is not good. Now, depending on your relationship with your in-laws, that, feedback might be interpreted differently. What you're doing is not good, Jethro says, but he has the utmost care for Moses in mind. Moses, I can see after 3 hours of watching you deal with all these people, and I can see the line that is extending, or the horde that is extending, right, out beyond. You're not going to be able to reach all of these people in one day. And there were a lot of problems that were actually coming about because of the way that Moses was handling this problem. And I think it's really relevant to say, it's not that Moses was doing anything wrong, right? He was teaching the people the word of the Lord, right? He was trying to handle their disputes in a fair and a just way. And he had this system, probably the best system he could think of in the moment, to try and work through all of the problems. It probably didn't start out with a whole horde of people. It was the first individuals, probably with Egypt still in sight, who had a problem about the marching order or something like that, and he handles that. And over and over and over, it begins to build and build and build until he has a full day's worth of appointments and many, many, many people who can't even fit in his calendar. There are 4 problems that I think were leading to Moses' burnout. The first is that Jethro says, the task is too heavy for you. Literally, the problem of judging the entire nation of Israel is too much for you to bear. It's not that you're weak. It's not that you're not talented or a gifted administrator. The task is simply too heavy for you to do on your own. Or at least it's too heavy for you to do on your own indefinitely. Second, the people were frustrated, and that should not be discounted. The fact is that because it was only Moses who was, walking people through this situation, people were going away dissatisfied. They couldn't see Moses in a day. They'd be waiting in line. They had gotten their ticket number, but they were never called. And so because of that, there were conflicts that weren't being resolved. There were problems around. Third is Jethro recognizes whether it was happening or he's sort of forecasting and saying, eventually, Moses, you're going to wear out. You are going to burn out. You are not going to be able to do this much longer. And that's going to be a huge problem because you are the one leading the people through the desert. You are the one, before this time, they were just heading, we'll get to this in Numbers, but they had not yet begun to wander for 40 years. At this point, it is simply, we are following the Lord and his path to the promised land. And they need a leader to do that. And Jethro says, you're not going to be their leader very long if you keep doing this. Fourth, the plan was based on self-reliance. And it's, again, I don't think that Moses was necessarily ignorant in this regard. It's probably just the beginning stages. It's the first stop that they had. But at the same time, we have to recognize that the problem here was that Moses was taking all the weight of the people, all the weight of the leadership, all the weight of the burden of the situation that was far too heavy for him, and he was the one wearing it solely upon his shoulders. And so what does Jethro say? Well, he says, you need to appoint other people to do it. You need to ask other people to help you out in this situation. And I think that we need to be careful, right, that like the main takeaway from this is not that delegation is how we get out of burnout. There are a number of situations that could have worked so that Moses would be able to come out of this, right? This is the situation that Jethro in his wisdom suggested. What I want to point to, though, is the far greater lesson, which is the fact that both Moses and Jethro recognize that the Lord is the one that they are going to for their strength. If you look back at this passage, you see the number of times that God is mentioned, right? Even before this, when Moses was telling Jethro about how they got out of Egypt, right? And every single thing is, the Lord did this, the Lord did this. Well, the Lord provided the solution. The circumstances that were surrounding Pharaoh and bending him so that he would eventually let these people go and be free, God brought about each of those circumstances. And so it is in Moses' mind, it is in Jethro's mind now, as he was so impressed, right? The reason he converted to faith is because he says, wow, how great is God that he did all of these things in Egypt. So now we take it to this situation, and we have to maintain that same thought. It is the Lord who is working in their life. It is the Lord who is bringing about this situation. It is the Lord who cares for Moses. It is the Lord who wants to see him avoid burnout. It is the Lord who provides a solution, and Moses is simply wise enough to recognize that Jethro is the conduit that it's being delivered through. And so I think it's good for us, right, to keep in mind how we are so often falling into the same footsteps of Moses. We find a situation that is far too heavy for us. And sometimes we've brought it upon ourselves, and sometimes it just hits us straight smack in the face, and we just have to deal with it. But we find a situation that's too heavy for us. The people around us who see us walking through this by ourselves, they begin to grow frustrated and irritated. That's probably especially true if this is some kind of workplace conflict, or maybe you have a boss that you can't stand at a job that you desperately need, and people are becoming weary because somebody is experiencing burnout. Not to mention you're becoming weary, but then ultimately, and this is where the main part of our lesson today is coming from, is that at the foundation, one of the problems with burnout is that we are always trying to solve the problems by ourselves. We are always trying to find the solutions and the ways out, the pathways by ourselves. And it might be that we're asking other people for their help. It might be these kinds of things, but we're simply looking on a horizontal plane. And what I'm saying that Moses, through Jethro, was doing is he's looking on a vertical plane. That is really our point. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. So Moses chose able men from all Israel and made them leaders over the people, as commanders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They judged the people at all times. They would bring the hard cases to Moses, but they would judge every minor case themselves. Moses let his father-in-law go, and he journeyed to his own land. And that is the system that they end up running with from then on. This was a change that Moses made, and because of it, because he recognized that the Lord was the one who was working through Jethro, because the Lord was the one who was directing him, he was able to avoid this burnout. So, what do we take away from this story? Well, in order to beat burnout, you have to rely on God instead of yourself. And you might hear that and say, well, I don't know, Connor, that's kind of a pithy statement. Like, well, of course I need to rely on God. The problem is that we often walk into burnout, and then we recognize that we're in it, and then we come to this point, if we've known Christ, right, and we understand our relationship with him, we say to ourselves, okay, well, now I should go to God. I should rely on him. But the failure that we make is then we expect that because we have sort of completed this transaction, okay, Lord, I come to you. Now what's the solution? Give me the solution. Where's my Jethro? And we have this anticipation, not so much that we can just trust on God to get us through the situation, but rather that God is going to lay out this like 8-step framework plan to bring us out of whatever it is that we're going through. And then when that does not immediately happen, when our burnout is not immediately resolved or within, as we would think, a reasonable time frame, then we become dissatisfied with God. Then we become frustrated with him because we say, God, where are you in the midst of what I'm going through? How is it that you can say that I can trust on you and you're not immediately delivering me from my situation? We end up having a transactional relationship with God. Like we have given him attention and therefore he is supposed to give us a solution. And friends, God is not a vending machine. We can't shake him and expect something to roll out the bottom, right? In order to beat burnout, you have to rely on God instead of yourself. And that trust has to simply be based on the fact that you know that the problem, the situation that you're in, is too heavy for you, that you cannot do it on your own, but God is big enough to handle your problem. The means in which he will handle your problem, leave that up to him. It could come in many, many different ways. So, what does this look like in practical terms? Well, some of you might, if you were here last week, you heard Jim mention that I was, I was down in Florida because my wife's grandfather, Francis Gardner, turned 100 years old, okay? And he was a pilot on a B-17 bomber in World War II. He was specifically a tail gunner over in the European theater. And I want to share with you, we were going through some of his things, right? And he had a journal, a diary that he had written to his wife. And he was explaining one of the situations that he had encountered while he was over fighting in Europe. And I want you, as I read this story to you, and you have to forgive me, I'm going to need to read it here. I don't have this memorized. But I want you to be thinking about what it means to be somebody who is facing a situation that is far too heavy for them to endure on their own, and how he chose to rely on God instead of himself, and what that looked like. It was soon afterwards, I was traveling to my last camp in the States, and on my way to England to join other airmen for the Battle of the Skies over Europe. I was taking Jesus with me and was going to put my trust in him forever. I remember one morning in May 1944, our crew went to the briefing room to receive information for the day's mission. It was the Big B, as we called it. Of course, this was Berlin, Germany. One could hear a pin drop, and then chills and fear would run through our bodies because we knew that danger and a possible death was ahead. I knew that there was one answer for a safe mission, and that to trust in Jesus and commit the day's mission to my Lord, that he would be with me all the way, and that his will be done. The time came for takeoff, and our plane was soon into the air and onward to bomb the enemy from the sky. 2.5 hours passed, and our ship was in formation and the planes ready to cross into enemy territory. I took time out from my work back there in the tail of the plane to talk to Jesus, that he would ride with me and guide us all on our trip in the air. I loved my Lord and knew that Jesus would go with me all the way. It was not too long when a few miles away from Berlin and one could see the flak coming up as the men looked for enemy fighters. The flak was breaking all around us as the bomb bay doors came open. Any moment now, the signal for the bombs to go down would be given. A few seconds passed and bombs away. The anti-aircraft fire was getting closer and ships were being hit and going down in flames in a matter of seconds. The flak had broken up our formation, our plane was hit, and one of our engines knocked out. Then fighter attacks coming in at all angles. Our plane was losing altitude, and we had to leave the other planes and go by ourselves. Soon our ship was attacked by fighters coming head-on. The gunners in the nose fought them off, and 2 enemy fighters went down. Things were plenty hot, and the earth was 5 miles below. I realized only Jesus could help us, as we were alone in the sky, fighting for life. The enemy had got one engine, and now a 20-millimeter shell hole was in our wing, big enough for a Jeep to drive through. And then another engine went out. A fighter came around the tail, and I had to trust God to help me beat the enemy with my 2 machine guns. I cried to Jesus for help as he came closer, and I opened up, and he went plunging down to the earth. Soon we had done away with the enemy, and our problem was to get back to our base in England about 600 miles away with a crippled plane. The tears rolled down my face as I called on God for help. I then pushed the interphone button and told the fellows I was asking God for help. They told me if I ever prayed hard to do it now. I prayed and trusted God all the way. The Bible says Jesus saves. Yes, the Lord brought us over many miles of water and back to our base in England. I knew God to be closer than a brother, dearer than a friend, and knew that all things are possible with God. I love my Savior more than ever for a near miracle in the wild blue yonder during a combat mission over Germany. So, for a teenager fighting Nazis, right? The situation is too heavy to handle by himself. And so what does Francis do? But he goes to the only one that he knows can handle that situation, and it's his Lord. So you might say, well, is that burnout though, right? How long did they have to deal with that? Well, this was 30 combat missions that he went on with his team. These are actually he wrote this down on a 1-pound note, and you'd see Berlin here, that's what we just read about, but then his second to last one, it says invasion, and that was D-Day. 30 missions over 4 months. What was the outcome? He said this, as a tail gunner, if anyone came in on the tail, I'd get shot at. I never got injured. There were 10 of us. We all started together and finished together, and nobody was wounded and nobody was killed. It was a miracle. The guys used to say the plane came back in one piece because I was the preacher. I figured it was all part of my job. We wanted to take care of the Germans and get the war over with. I did a lot of praying back then. So Francis, you would not be surprised, ended up becoming a pastor. And this was the story, though, that he would tell. Amongst many others. I picked one story, right? But what is so amazing to me about this is that no matter the situation that was coming up there, it was just too heavy. And he wasn't going to God, anticipating some specific way that the Lord was going to help him. He just said, Lord, this is too much for me. And when the enemy is bearing down, he just yelled out to Jesus. I think that it's so important for us to recognize what it means to truly rely on God and not just rely on him because we think something's going to happen, right, as this transaction, but to truly rely on him and have faith that he is going to come out. He is going to handle our situation. And here's the truth, is that I don't know how your situation, how your burnout is going to be solved. There are thousands of different ways in which you could become burnout, and even more thousands of ways in which the Lord can fix your situation. What I do know is that the Lord is big enough to handle whatever problem you're going through. I do know that the Lord can handle the heaviness of your situation, and if you choose to rely exclusively on yourself to get out of this situation, you're going to get burnout and grow weary. And the people around you are going to get burnt out and grow weary. And ultimately, you're going to suffer physically, you're going to suffer emotionally, and you're probably going to suffer spiritually because if you're in burnout, one of the main signifying marks of it is that you feel a whole lot of indifference and apathy. You just say, what's the point anymore? I've been going through this situation for so darn long that I can't see the end in sight. Well, I'm sure when Moses was looking at the people and the line of hundreds of individuals that he was never going to get to, he needed somebody to come along and say, hey, maybe there's a different way here. We need to trust on the Lord to be able to handle our situation. So in summary, I would say there are many ways that the Lord is going to fix and help you walk through your burnout. Maybe he is going to bring a Jethro into your life, somebody who can give you wise counsel, somebody who can give you a very practical solution to this, in Moses' case, logistical problem that was present. Maybe that's how the Lord's going to do it. Maybe like last week, the Lord is going to come alongside you and give you an almost supernatural kind of rest, something to help you through a hot bread and a nap like he did for Elijah so that you could continue on to finish the mission. Or maybe what the Lord is going to provide for you is simply the faith, an amazing faith, to be able to trust that he's going to get you through to the other side whenever that is. I think that's what I see in the story of Francis. God got him through, and he wasn't particularly concerned with how it happened, but he trusted on the Lord the entire way. So as we close this morning, I wrote out a prayer that I think sort of encapsulates all of this. And so I'm going to read the prayer, and I would encourage you to just kind of, in your mind, read along with me and think about your own situation. Lord, this situation is too heavy for me to handle on my own. I am tired, weary, and I need help. I know that you are the only one who can truly provide relief because you are bigger than all of my problems. I am guilty of relying on myself far more often than I rely upon you. Lord, whether your aid comes in the form of my own Jethro, an amazing faith, or some other means, I trust that my problem is best left in your mighty hands. Will you give me encouragement to endure this hardship? Will you protect me from weariness, heartache, and discouragement? Lord, thank you. Amen. I think that this is the kind of attitude that we need to have. And so my encouragement to you is that if you're in this period of burnout, or maybe you can see, like Jethro saw to Moses, that you're heading towards it, that you would already begin to start developing that relationship with God that says, I trust in you full stop. I don't trust in you because I anticipate a solution, even though I have faith that it will come. I trust in you full stop because I know that you are good and you are mighty and you can handle it and you will. That is the level of faith that we need to have in God. And that is the thing that will help us to beat burnout. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come before you one more time, and I simply say, Lord, please help us. Please help us as we're walking through burnout. Please help us as we are trying, and often have been trying our hardest, to simply pick ourselves up by our bootstraps and get it done. Except, Lord, that's not enough. The situation is too heavy. It's too much, and we can't bear it on our own. Lord, I pray that you would help us by the power of your Spirit to have this kind of faith that Francis had, to have the kind of faith that Moses and Jethro had, to be able to say, Lord, we trust in you. Whatever the solution is, Lord, we trust that you're going to bring it. And Lord, even if the solution doesn't look like what we planned, we still trust in you. Father, it is weak of us to rely upon ourselves. Yet it is in our weakness, Lord, your strength is shown when we rely upon you. God, we love you and we thank you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
All right, we're back at the studio. Thank you for another sermon in this series, Connor.
Yeah.
This is kind of our short term between two longer term and between Easter. So
That's right. Yeah.
We heard some feedback from listeners
Yeah, we
or
did.
viewers
Requests.
from the Gibsons.
Yeah, Roger and Rebecca, shout out.
Definitely shout out.
They were asking me, what about Jethro, right? So Jethro enters into this story as Moses' father-in-law, and we don't hear about him much, but he's kind of has these titles associated with him. He's known as a priest of Midian. And so their question was, what's his deal? They didn't say it like that, but they were like, where is he coming from? Because Exodus 18, he comes in and has this, before they get to take your father-in-law to work day, they have this feast, right, with the elders of Israel and all of these things. And I had made the point in the lesson about how this might be seen as some kind of conversion, or we don't really know what the priest part of Jethro's role was. So I dug into it a little bit more. I'd done some research, but I dug into it a little bit more. And here's where I say, I don't think it's to the level where I need to make like a mea culpa, but I probably spoke with a little too much confidence in making a point out of Jethro's conversion in Exodus 18. But maybe I can explain in a little bit more detail why this is there are people who are divided on this. And the question is, for any kind of the uninitiated, So Jethro comes in and says in Exodus 18, this statement about, wow, really, it is the Lord who is above all other gods. And so the question is, he's a priest of Midian. We know that. Is he a priest of the Lord, or is he a priest of some other gods?
Right.
What's his background? Okay. So, background is Father Abraham had many sons.
Right.
Many sons had Father Abraham, right? Okay, so after Sarah dies, he gets remarried, okay? And in his second marriage, he has 6 more sons. I think it's 6. He has 6 more sons. They are Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. That's with his wife Keturah. Okay, so he has 6 more sons, and those end up becoming fathers of other nations. But significantly, one of them is Midian.
Midianites,
right?
Right.
And so those end up becoming, yes, the Midianites. And what's interesting is that obviously Abraham is before the exile into Egypt. And so we have hundreds of years where this nation is about to move forward. And okay, and so that's the origin of Midian. Now let's get to kind of the basically the end of the Midian story, is that even by the time of the end of the Exodus, by the end of their journeying through the desert, and certainly by the time of the Judges, once they've landed in the Promised Land, Israel and Midian are bitter enemies.
Right.
In fact, it's at the very end of the book of Numbers that the Lord instructs Moses to go to war against Midian. Okay? Midian, this is a bit of a teaser for our series we'll get into after the Burnout one, but we're going through the book of Numbers. And the book of Numbers includes this accounting where the nation of Midian teamed up with the nation of Moab to hire this sort of wicked prophet to curse Israel. It's this whole story. It's really interesting. But nevertheless, Midian is against Israel, right? They want to fight them, and ultimately they are destroyed by Israel. Okay, so that's the end point. The beginning point is that they began as an offshoot of Abraham. And the question is, and the difficult part is, where does Jethro fit into this story of being a part of a wicked nation, right? Is he this righteous minority that is still connected to the faith of his fathers? Or is he, following after the gods of Midian who did not worship the Lord, and he's just generally a good man otherwise, and then comes to faith with Moses.
Because he was called a priest, it doesn't mean that he was a follower of Yahweh. He could have been any kind of priest. Okay.
So, that's kind of the spectrum. Now I've got a couple things on either side, and then you can sort of choose for yourself. Okay. So, let's talk about the argument against him being a follower of God. Okay. The argument against him is fairly straightforward. It is that when he's introduced, Jethro basically has 2 passages where he's introduced. It's Exodus 2, which is when Moses flees to Midian, finds Jethro's 7 daughters who are shepherdesses. They are going to the well.
And he kind of saves them.
Yeah, they get bullied away from the well.
Mm-hmm.
Moses saves them. Jethro invites him over for dinner, and then Zipporah, his daughter, is given in marriage to Moses. And then Moses lives in Midian, in the land of Midian, for the next 40 years. So the case against him is frankly just he's guilty by association with the Midianites, right? Mm-hmm. There is, outside of Jethro, there is no evidence of Midian having anybody who really comes to be a righteous individual. In fact, later on, when Israel starts intermarrying in the land, in the book of Judges, one of the problems is that they're marrying Midianite and Moabite women, right, who are obviously infiltrating is probably not the right word, but bringing their idolatrous ways to Israel. Okay, so guilty by association, that doesn't always cover it, but it's certainly a smoking gun, right? Then you have the fact that he's introduced as a priest of Midian. And so in order to make the statement that he was a priest of the Most High God, which you would kind of think would have been included in the narrative, but we can't make an argument from silence. But to say that he was a priest and not that he was a priest of the Most High God seems like a bit of an omission. And it would also rely on this idea that a nation that very, very soon is going to turn against Israel, be against Israel's God, so on and so forth, is worshiping false gods, that Jethro has maintained the faith of his fathers from hundreds and hundreds of years beforehand and is operating as a priest in the land of Midian amongst, we don't know. You would have to create this idea that there is some sect of a small group of people who are still devoted to the Lord. But again, that's in silence, and it's based upon the idea that
in a pagan nation.
In a pagan nation that
he was the remnant.
Just like a couple years after Jethro's visit to Moses is going to try and wage war against Israel.
Right.
The last one is just context. And again, these are all sort of weak. The case against Jethro, either way, is sort of weak. But the other thing would just be his statements in Exodus 18, namely that he says that the Lord is the greatest God above all the other gods. And you're like, well, all right, Jethro, that's kind of a weird thing to say.
Yeah.
Right.
It's kind of weird. And then also the fact that it says that he goes and offers this burnt offering. But it kind of makes it sound like, and maybe that's the way I'm just reading the story, but it kind of makes it sound like he converts, he makes this statement of faith, and then he goes forward with this process of recognizing the Lord with burnt offerings, right?
Yeah.
It would be, I don't know, the other side of that would be that he had brought a flock. Obviously, he came with animals, that he had brought them with the anticipation of meeting up with Moses and sacrificing there. Anyhow, okay, so that's one side. Like I said, it's not super convincing, but you kind of have to make some leaps. However, there are a number of things in favor of him being a man of God. So the first one to begin with is that in Genesis 2, when Jethro is introduced, after it's stating that he was a priest of Midian, it says that his name is Reuel, or Reuel. Okay, and that means friend of God. That's what that name means. And so he's introduced by that name, and that would probably be because Jethro means like excellence or something like that. And so it could be that Reuel is like his family name or something. And so, right, how much? Not every single name in the Old Testament is something that we're supposed to make somebody's identity up out of, but it's interesting. For most of the rest of the story, though, he goes by the name Jethro. 2, again, these are all things that are kind of in favor of him being a family of the Lord, would be that Moses attaches himself to Jethro. Now, maybe that is because he had a sincere lack of options out in Midian, but, Moses kind of casts himself, right? Especially when he's leaving Egypt. He has killed somebody because he is dedicated to his people, to Israel, and therefore to his Lord. And so to go to Midian and to attach himself so clearly to somebody who did not follow after the Lord, or was openly against it, now we're getting into sort of what Moses was like and his identity and things like that, but you can see kind of the conflict there, why that might be sort of a weird situation. And beyond that, the fact that he maintained contact with Jethro through all these 40 years and leaves his family with them. Though there are some signs that later on, there's that really odd story, if anybody's familiar, where Moses is instructed to circumcise his children, and it's sort of unclear what happens, but the Lord is ready to kill him because of the way that things have gone about. And elsewhere, as they're going through the desert, there are some signs that Zipporah, his wife, might not be as faithful as he is.
Right.
Okay.
And is that maybe because she was immersed in this culture? I mean, it's
great question.
Guilt by association.
Great question. They're all these little things we're picking up. Like I said, so the other one that could flip is that the burnt offering, the fact that he's doing this. We've seen other cases in the Bible where somebody goes over to God and then immediately has this conversion experience. And in the New Testament, it would be, they say they want to immediately get baptized. Well, in the Old Testament, it might be that they immediately give burnt offerings. So you could actually argue that in the other side for Jethro, that
Like
that
Simon
was
the sorcerer type in Acts, just wanting to see what that could do for him, maybe, or
maybe.
Oh,
Yeah.
But I mean, you could construe this as him being a man of faith, and because Leviticus hasn't happened yet, right?
right.
So we're in Exodus. So the commands to give everybody what the burnt offering is hasn't been
Right.
presented. So then that gets us to really the last piece of information that sort of, or I would say could go in his favor, which is that Jethro is presented kind of like the figure Melchizedek in Genesis. So Melchizedek was a priest from the land of Salem, which is the, grandpa to Jerusalem later on, later becomes Jerusalem. He's presented as this kind of Christ-like figure. He is presented as certainly a faithful person, but significantly as a Gentile. He's a Gentile who is faithful to the Lord and speaks with Abraham and lets him know about, and Abraham gives him a tenth of his possessions. It's this whole thing. Well, some people make Jethro out to be a similar Melchizedek type figure, and that he was a priest who came from a Gentile land, who gave kind of counsel and advice to a leader of the Israelite people, and was obviously given a great deal of respect. It's not a super strong connection, but nevertheless. So that kind of presents the case on either side. Either Jethro was a righteous man in an exceedingly small minority in Midian, or he was an unrighteous person who is ultimately converted to following after Yahweh, and then brought that faith back to Midian, we can assume. So that's the long and the short of it. I probably shouldn't have made an entire point out of the fact that it was a conversion experience, because evidence context might go both ways, but it's not a clear-cut case that he was this. You get what I'm saying? So
I think it's just, and obviously some of this I don't think we can really know. I think that's fair to say, but it's interesting to think about the possibility of pockets of God-fearing people worshiping Yahweh.
Yeah. Well, think of Rahab.
So we do have some context for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
and I think this is one of those things when the Bible, and you just say, you shouldn't base an entire story or point on, who Jethro was and what he did. He presents an interesting figure. The takeaway from 18 is what he did for Moses.
Right.
And he brought some real wisdom too.
Yeah, he did.
That was godly wisdom.
It was.
And Moses certainly listened to him.
Yeah.
Not all sons-in-law would.
Well, and I had a thought when I was listening to the sermon. I'm like, do you think, I don't know, this is maybe just me putting maybe my own personality or my own thoughts into the story, but I kind of feel like maybe that Moses was kind of like proud to show Jethro all he was doing. I don't know if we know that for sure or not. I just know in my mind I probably would be like, hey, look at this. I'm kind of judging for, we're serving God this way, and was kind of like, oh, you don't think that's so good. That's just the way I see it. I don't know.
No, when I've read this passage before, I have had that same thought. It's like, I wonder if Moses kind of felt like, oh man, here I was so proud of everything I've done, and I wanted to show off, and maybe not in those words,
or
but
just make
some pride.
Yeah,
in
I don't know how
he'd
he has
accomplished.
pride and show. Yeah, I don't know, someone that he cares about or that he's doing well or something like that. Yeah. But when I read that story and what Jethro tells him to do, seems pretty practical.
Yeah,
and almost common sense to me, because obviously Moses probably shouldn't have kept up with that schedule and that pace, but. Why do you think that it took Jethro helping him out that way?
Yeah.
For him to realize or for him to change that. Do you think he's just too close to the situation, or?
Well, maybe, but I think we should give just a little bit more credit to to Moses and how remarkable his situation truly was
Sure.
that he was in. You know, I mean, you got to think let's go back to the burning bush, right? Where Moses is listening to God. And remember, they have this whole dialogue and this whole discussion. I think it's 5 times Moses says that he shouldn't be the one that goes to rescue his people.
Right.
And the Lord says, okay, after like the 5th time, fine.
Yeah, that's true.
Aaron can go with you and do it. But along the
I
way,
can't speak well. I'm not. Yeah, he had all the excuses.
Yeah. But at the same time, Moses is clearly presented as the leader over all the people. He is the conduit through which the Lord moves in, either through he or Aaron. All of the miracles happen, all of the plagues happen, right?
Yeah.
And beyond that, Moses is the one who is given the charge to lead them out, to speak to Pharaoh, so on and so forth. And so, and then later on, just a little bit later in Exodus, right, Moses is going to be the one who specifically by himself has to go up and receive the Mosaic covenant. I think it's like 5 or 7 times that he goes up and down Mount Sinai to receive these things, sometimes fasting 40 days up there. He's the one who he's the only one who can go into the tabernacle once it's built and be in the Holy of Holies. He's the only one where his face glows. So Moses' journey, even though not all of it had happened by Exodus 18, is marked by being the individual responsible for speaking on behalf of Israel and being the lawgiver. Aaron comes along as the high priest, and that's a significant role that he fulfills. But even then, Moses is the one who is giving the instructions to Aaron about what that priestly order should look like. So I think you say, was he too close to the situation? I mean, maybe, but I think it's fair that Moses would have been under the assumption that it was his job to sort of, take care of the people and administer this. Not to mention that one of the functions that he was doing and the function that Jethro commends him for is that he is teaching the people the law.
Right.
And so maybe he didn't feel that the commanders of, thousands, hundreds, tens, so forth, that they would know the law or whatever. And so I think that 2 things. One is that we can probably give him a little bit more credit for not recognizing what most leadership books today would, kind of be talking about, and delegation and time management and prioritizing, what's the most important thing. But at the same time, it kind of depends where your timeline is, but they have maybe within the last month, 2 months, crossed the Red Sea. Everybody is bickering and fighting. And so I could understand part of it why he might not want to delegate. But as far as the solution to Jethro, I go back to what I had said, which is that I think he recognized where the answer was ultimately coming from. I think he recognized there's like 4 different times in that passage where it's like, God be with you, pick God-fearing men, pick those who love the Lord, pick all of this kind of thing. And maybe if it wasn't that clear, at the very least, I think Moses would recognize somebody speaking into his life about something that the Lord does care about, which was the health of Israel.
Right.
But it can be hard to recognize that coming into your life sometimes.
Yeah, I just know from, and obviously not any type of task like Moses had, set before him, but, tasks that you can get buried in, whether it's a event you're planning for or whatever it is. It's kind of sometimes I feel like you get so into the work that you maybe don't see that the work is kind of, you're getting close to burnout, or the work is kind of overwhelming you.
Yeah.
And there might be a solution if you're willing to step back and see, like, maybe you don't have to be the one doing every bit of it. At the very first Camp Catapult, which camp for elementary kids in the summer, the very first one we had, I think that I definitely fell into that trap. It was the first camp. There was not a lot of people that had, it was a new vision, that kind of thing. But I remember this was pre-COVID, so Walmart was truly open 24 hours a day. I remember, I think on a Thursday morning at 2:00 in the morning, getting tempera paint for the craft that we were doing. And I'm thinking, looking back, I'm like, what in the world? Why was I, but I was in the middle of the week and we were trying to, making it work and that kind of thing. Fast forward a couple of years later, there's a lot more people that have caught the vision, and whether or not it's me willing to delegate some of those, and even more important tasks than going to Walmart to get tempera paint. Just something I've learned is it's pretty freeing when you've got capable people, and that can, I think, help safeguard you to burn out a little bit.
Let me ask you then. So when you were buying tempera paint at 2 a.m., I mean, was Angie over here saying like, hey, Jason, you've got volunteers who could perhaps help you with some of these things? I guess my question is, what was the step that it took for you to begin opening that up to other people?
Chances are she was on aisle 10 getting craft sticks.
Yeah, that's probably true.
No, I think that when we were in that stage of that camp, I think that I was kind of what I was saying, and maybe was reading maybe a little too much into maybe Moses's situation. I think I was so deep into the planning of it, and we needing to make this event work, that I didn't take the time or feel like I had the time to step back and say, who could be doing this?
Yeah.
It was like full bore ahead. This is the first year we've ever done this, and that kind of thing. And it wasn't until with a group of people, and we had a lot of volunteers for that camp. I mean, you can't not have with 500 kids, and but the main group of leaders that had helped plan everything, we did a pretty thorough, and one of the volunteers in particular kind of created a survey for us and other leaders. And it wasn't until then I realized really the enormity of the camp and all the things that took to do it. And so that's kind of when I saw that, I was like, okay, we got to do this different in years to come. Yeah. I probably won't make it.
But sticking with Camp Catapult, I'm thinking back to, because it's one of our biggest initiative. The light show is huge, and that it reaches maybe more people if you don't count the family members of the kids in Camp Catapult.
Sure.
I like to count the family members, but it takes more volunteers than the light show does, Catapult does.
Yeah.
And so that reaches broader, and there's more responsibility for everyone. I look back to 2019, and one of those 3 core volunteers, Seneva.
Yeah.
Something profound happened health emergency in their family, and she had to step away and allow others to do it. 2021, Jeremiah Devine, who's doing worship for Camp Catapult, lost his mom.
Right.
And then last year with Angie's dad's health crisis. Right. And it just, those were all catalysts that caused us to take a look and realize that there are people. And I just think of that, kind of that Jethro moment. It wasn't someone sitting down and saying, hey, Jason, you need to be able to delegate this. It was necessity. And we realized that as much as our hearts grieve those situations, they really did make the program and made all the people involved stronger.
Well, there's a guy named Jerry Krieger that goes to TBC, and he's very good with logistics.
Yes.
I'm not really great with logistics. And so the first 2 years of Camp Catapult are outdoor rotations. They didn't all line up. I kind of created the rotations, and it's like, hey, do we have to do archery 4 times? And we never get to do that. I'm like, oh, no, that's not really supposed to be that way. And so Jerry sat down with me, and I told him kind of about what was going on. He's like, well, I would just be happy to do that part.
That's his wheelhouse.
And I'm like,
please
really?
Let me take this
you
from
do
you.
That?
Let me write a formula to figure that out.
So he brought it back the next week, and it was all perfect.
Yes.
And I said, well, I don't know why, it was so hard for me to do that. And he said, do you understand how many different things that this camp has to do and how many variables? I'm like, no, absolutely not. He said, what I did was him and his wife sat down and they put pennies as people and went all around.
Wow.
And he took several hours that I simply hadn't taken or didn't have to do. And he took that on and put his whole heart into that. And it just, helped out a lot. So
I think it's, the hard thing is you look back at all those situations and you say, well, like, who couldn't have figured that out? Meaning why didn't we see the need for these kinds of things early on? Why didn't Moses see the need to delegate early on, or whatever it was? And that was the one thing that I wish I could have reinforced a little bit more in the message was, this fact that it's so hard when you're in the middle of burnout or you're heading towards it. Sometimes one of the hardest things is realizing that you're heading towards burnout. That when you're in there, to recognize how God might be able to help you beat it, right? And that God might be using people like Jethro. He might be using situations, logistics. He might be using rest, as we talked about. He might be using a whole lot of different things. But the point is that God desires for us to not become burdened in that way, or at least to not indefinitely be burdened in that way. And yet when we sort of come out on the other side of those situations of our burnout or whatever, sometimes we have such a short-sighted summary of it. We say, well, if I had just done this, this, and this, then that whole thing would have never had to happen. And I think the proper response there is, well, if God gave me this, he let me walk through this space for a time, and then God was the one who brought this solution or this exit for me or whatever it is, and we can praise God for the lessons that we learned walking through that burnout, and we don't have to be so, our sight doesn't have to be so truncated, our lesson, if you will, that, well, I should have learned that from the very first. Well, it's like, well, maybe you were supposed to learn that lesson a little bit later on at the time when God had it for you, so that you could walk through those things and maybe you could use it for the next time.
And it would have more impact on you because you had to get that far into burnout before you really realized it.
I think that there are just a lot of people who, some of it's innocently and some of it's willfully, think that the Christian life is just supposed to be a cakewalk and that any difficulty that comes about is God's lack of faithfulness to them or their, some dramatic thing that has happened in their faith world. And that's a huge topic and that's a significant issue, but at the same time, burnout happens. And it's more about what is our faith going to look like when we're walking through it, and the trust that we place in God and the reliance on him as the one who's powerful enough to bring us out. I'm confident that some people head towards burnout, and God is happy to let some of them head towards burnout because it finally brings them back to him.
Yeah, absolutely. Your faith is not defined by these episodes.
Right.
Your whole faith trajectory is not defined by the burnout episodes, but they can refine your trajectory because of them.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. All right. So what do we have? Do we have anything else? All right.
Yeah, so we've got 2 weeks left in Burnout, and Jim's coming up this Sunday, and then I'll finish it out, and then we'll begin the series in Numbers.
That's not even enough time to get burned out on burnout. No. Just 4 weeks.
Just 4 weeks.
4 weeks.
That's how we get to beat it.
Very. Just make it short. All right. Thanks for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you for listening to the TBC Extra Podcast. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.
We drop an episode every Wednesday, and on the first Friday of each month, we have an extra episode. Extra! With stories, pastoral teaching, interviews, and more.
See you next time, and have a great rest of your week.